Ivan Pavlov is a name you'll hear a lot in psychology, but the truth is he stumbled upon one of the most important concepts in psychology today. He was actually studying dogs and salivation and wasn't really trying to find what inevitably changed the face of psychology. So make sure you know that he was actually working with dogs and salivation, but he stumbled upon and created a term called classical conditioning. You'll want to know his research, but you'll also want to know the four main elements of classical conditioning and be able to identify them in his research. What Pavlov noticed is that dogs naturally salivate to food. Not just dogs, people naturally salivate to food. I myself naturally salivate to food. So what we have to start with classical conditioning is a reflex, something that happens naturally. What Pavlov discovered is if you combine something new with a stimulus that already naturally creates a response, if you pair that association strong enough, then you can get the same response to this new stimulus. So in Pavlov's research, here's what he did. He noticed again that dogs would salivate to food. We're going to call the food the unconditioned stimulus, and we're going to call salivating to the food the unconditioned response. Now, when you look at these terms, it's really helpful to break them down word by word. So if something is unconditioned, that means it's unlearned, so it's natural. A stimulus is a thing that causes a response, and a response is just a behavior. So if you break the terms down that way, it becomes a whole lot easier to work with them and identify them in examples. Don't just memorize the definitions for those terms, because that's actually not going to help you as much as you think it will. Break down what those words mean. So Pavlov has an unconditioned stimulus of food and an unconditioned response of salivating to food. But what Pavlov discovered and what he researched is that if you combine a new stimulus, in this case a metronome, which is a fancy word for a bell, if you combine a bell or a metronome with food, in other words, every time the dogs receive food, they also hear the sound of the metronome, then eventually you don't even have to give the dogs food, and they will salivate any time they hear that metronome or that bell. So when we combine something new or something neutral with an unconditioned stimulus, it becomes a conditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's research, the metronome was the conditioned stimulus. If we have conditioned successfully, then when we present the conditioned stimulus, that metronome, then we get the same response we got before. This time, it's salivation not to food, but salivation to the metronome. So we call that the conditioned response, salivation to the metronome. The research itself isn't all that confusing, but identifying these terms is really, really difficult for some people. So again, read that textbook carefully, work with those practice questions, and you'll be able to not just tell us what Pavlov did, but also break down each of the components in his research.